Characters. So when we're examining characters, the first type of there are two types of characters that we first think of. One would be the protagonist. That's our main character. It's the leading character or one of the major characters in a drama, a movie, a novel, or other fictional text like a short story. And then the second character would be the antagonist, a person who actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something. The antagonist is an adversary. However, it's also important that you take note of the fact that antagonists aren't always people. Sometimes a main character can find him or herself in an antagonistic situation. There's a movie that comes to mind. I can't think of the title of it, but the main character was played by Tom Hanks, and he was stranded on an island for like, I don't know, maybe the first 35 minutes of the movie. So at that moment, that island became the main character's antagonist. So just a tidbit that you should keep in mind, that sometimes you'll read stories and the antagonist may not be a person, but it might be a situation. Moving on. So what is characterization? Characterization in literature is a process authors use to develop characters. There are two different approaches to characterization. So essentially, characterization is how the character is developed. Simple as that. Nothing complicated about it, but there are a variety of things that we should look at when we are determining who the character is. So how are characters developed? They're developed through direct characterization, where the author tells us what he or she wants us to know about the character. And in that way, it's obvious. An example would be, he is tall. Well, we don't have to guess. There's no question, because the author has told us that the character is tall. But then let's look at indirect characterization. How would the author say the same thing indirectly? Well, when we look at indirect characterization, the author shows us things about the character to help us have an understanding of the character's personality and effect on other characters. But it's not limited to personality. It can also be a description, just as I gave you before. So I'm going to use that same description to indicate the character's height without coming out and directly telling you the character is tall. So here we go. Here's an example of indirect characterization. John stretched his arms as high as the sky. He was already as tall as the trees. So not only did I describe a tall person, he's a giant. But seriously though, hopefully you also noticed that in my indirect characterization, I used figurative language. Did you pick up on that? So again, with direct characterization, the author just tells us what he or she wants us to know about the character. And in indirect characterization, the author doesn't necessarily tell us directly, and it's alluded to either through figurative language or perhaps it's determined by things that the other characters say about the main character. Pairs. So pairs is a strategy that you can use, a sort of method rather, of characterization. It's important that you remember pairs. It's a mnemonic because it will help you not only to analyze characters, but when it's your time to write and develop a character, I'll repeat, when it's your turn to develop a character, hint, hint, then you'll know to use this method It'll make that process easier for you. So here are some of the things that we're looking at when we are analyzing and developing our own characters. 1 is physical description, 2, action, 3, inner thoughts, 4, reactions, and lastly, 5, speech. So we're going to revisit Star Wars, one of the greatest movies of all time, to look at this method of characterization. So we have physical description. When we are either developing or analyzing a character, with physical description is pretty self-explanatory. In fact, I think they all are, but we'll go through them anyway. We're looking at, well, how does the character look, and then what can we learn about this character based on his or her description. So we have Luke, and based on the physical description, we know that he is, well, this was a different planet Tatooine. I don't know if they call people white, but we'll say that he's white in complexion, or fair in complexion. He has a medium length, sandy brown hair, or dusty brown hair, brown eyes, perhaps green, a wide jaw, dimple in his chin, narrow but strong nose. These are some of the physical descriptions. Pensive. His eyes are pensive. So now if you notice, I'm giving adjectives to some of his characteristics, because once I start to give adjectives to the various descriptions, that will then add additional meaning. The A in pairs is action. So when we are developing and or analyzing our characters, we pay attention to the actions of the character. What does the writer want us to know based on what the character does? What do we learn about the character through his or her attitude? So A is not only for action, it is also for attitude and behaviors. So again, we're going to use Luke Skywalker. We know that he, through his actions, that he's curious. There's a restlessness about him. When we first meet him on the planet of Tatooine, he is working for his uncle, and he has a sense of calling and a sense of knowing that there's something more. There's something more for his life. We would even say that there's a little bit of rebelliousness in young Luke when we first meet him in Tatooine. And this is based on his actions. I is in pairs is for inner thoughts, or the interior monologue of our character. So when we examine the inner thoughts or the interior monologue of our character, we should ask ourselves, what does the writer want us to know about the character based on what the character's interior monologue is saying, or what is the character saying on the inside of his mind? And when we look at Star Wars as our example, we have a lot of insight into what's going on with young Luke Skywalker through Yoda. If you recall, for those of you who have seen it, I just assume that everyone has, but Yoda reads his mind, or I don't know if he really reads his mind, or if Yoda's just so in touch with the Force he can feel what's going on with Luke. And so, yeah, he reads his mind. So a lot of what's going on with Luke's interior monologue is actually revealed to us through Yoda. And in this moment, when they first meet, there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of questioning and uncertainty and doubt in the young Luke Skywalker. The R in pairs is for reactions, the reactions of the characters. When we find ourselves in this space, we have to ask, well, what does the writer want us to know about the character based on how the character responds in situations and to other characters? And to simplify it, because I know you probably will not remember a question as long as that, but just remember that the R in pairs is for the character's reactions. And that you're to ask yourself, well, what am I to learn? What am I to know about how this character responded in this situation? And you take note of it. When you write it down in your close reading, that's the kind of thing you would take note of. And so here, using again our young Luke Skywalker as an example, he learns that his father is Darth Vader, and Luke loses his hand. He loses his hand in this battle, and one would think that after learning that actually, wait, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm getting lost. I don't know if he learned that this was his father in this episode or not. And he did lose his hand. He had a battle with this. This is his first confrontation with Vader, and he did lose his hand. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, what did we learn from Luke Skywalker based on his reaction? So at the very beginning, we knew that he was restless, he was curious about life, and then we move on, and then there's uncertainty, and then there's doubt, and then he's placed in this position where he's lost his hand. And how he reacts at that moment really sets him up, his character, to become a leader, because he doesn't quit. At this point, he's full on committed to the rebellion. Next, we have the character speech. So we learn about the characters based on the things that they say. So again, when we are reading, plays, short stories, novels, we ask ourselves, what does the writer want me to know? What does the writer want us to determine about the character based on what the character says to the other characters? Also, based on what the other characters say to the main character, as well as what they say about the main character. So, here's an example. We have Darth Vader, and he says to Luke, "I am your father." So, we learn some things about Darth Vader through his speech, and we also learn some things about Luke, because when he does learn that Darth Vader is his father, it does create a bit of there's an internal struggle for him, and we see that internal struggle in Luke throughout several of the series. In fact, throughout the series until the end, possibly. Where there's always this battle between light and dark. Yeah? But this is one of those moments that's revealing, it's revelation. And we learn this through we learn about Luke's internal struggle, right? Through the speech, through the character speech. And then, as I said before, and in this case, is what the character says to another character. So now let's look at the different types of characters. So I've already mentioned protagonists and antagonists, but there are other types of characters, and it's important that you know them. In fact, if I recall, we did all of this. You have notes on this probably already from when we studied, I believe, the censor. If you do not have the notes already, then I highly advise you to take them. If necessary, push pause and play as many times as you need to. Go back to the beginning, But please make sure that you have a record of this. This is something that you need to know. And it's not only just so that you can get points, right? It's something that you need to take with you because, again, as you move throughout high school, you'll be analyzing characters. You'll need to know how to do a character analysis, of course, when you're taking those standardized tests. But most importantly, you have to know how to do these things for yourself because you never know. Some of you may have a gift for writing and you'll find yourselves having to develop characters of your own. So let's look at different types of characters. First, we have the static character. The static character is usually developed but does not change throughout the play, novel, or short story. So in Star Wars, we could say that Princess Leia was, in fact, a static character. She was fully developed, but she was consistent. There wasn't a lot of evolution in Leia's character. Then we have the dynamic character. The dynamic character is developed and evolves throughout the play, novel, or short story. Who do you think is the dynamic character in Star Wars? I bet you can't guess. It's Luke, of course. The entire story, the entire series for over maybe 30 years has focused on Luke's journey. Even in the most recent episode, it was Luke's evolution. It was the end of his journey when he finally transitioned to the Force, when he became part of the Force. That was the end of his journey, but he no doubt had several evolutions throughout Star Wars. So he is our dynamic character. The flat character is not developed, does not change, and we know little or nothing even sometimes about this character. The character is just there, and perhaps they play a supporting role or they're just in the background. But we could say that Chewbacca was definitely a flat character. He was a supporting character. However, we know very little about Chewbacca. Stock characters. The stock character is a stereotype or a cliche. And you may be thinking there are no stock characters in Star Wars. But yes, there is. C-3PO. C-3PO would be considered a stock character because he's a stereotypical nerd, right? He's a brainiac. So in every way, he would be our stock character. Then we have the round character. The round character is developed, may or may not change. So another character who is fully developed, we get backstory. Not in the very beginning of the Star Wars series, but later in another 2 or 3 episodes. Probably in the first through the third episode, we probably get a lot of information that develops this character. And that would be Darth Vader. I am your father. So Darth Vader would be an example of a round character. The foil is the direct opposite of another character, and usually it's the direct opposite of the main character. I'm going to repeat that again. The foil character is the direct opposite of another character, and typically the direct opposite of the main character. And the purpose of the foil is usually to highlight attributes of another character. So in Star Wars, Han Solo would be a foil to Luke Skywalker. Han Solo is older than Luke Skywalker. He's more mature. And so when they first meet, that becomes very obvious. And so Han Solo actually highlights the naivete of young Luke Skywalker. As Skywalker becomes older, more mature, it then becomes personalities there's like opposite in the personalities. Luke is a little bit more driven and committed to the Force and to the rebellion. Han Solo was oftentimes committed to the rebellion, however, was really because of his own self-interest. He was a renegade. So that would be an example of characters foiling each other and how one character highlights the attributes of another. The selfishness of Han Solo would highlight the selflessness of Luke Skywalker. And then we have our villain. The villain is similar to the antagonist, except the villain is always evil. The antagonist presents a conflict, presents opposition to our protagonist, but the antagonist doesn't always have to be evil. But the villain always is evil. And the actions and the motives of the villain drives the plot. And in Star Wars, our villain is Palpatine. And then I think this is the last type of character, would be the confidant. The confidant is someone or something the main character confides in and gives insight into the character. Stories don't always have confidants. However, in this story, we do, and this confidant has most recently become a favorite of many, especially with the introduction of the baby character, or the baby Yoda. So Yoda would be the confidant for young Luke Skywalker. He would go to him for counsel. Even as Luke Skywalker became older and Yoda had transitioned to be with the Force, I think there were times when he would call upon the wisdom of Yoda to guide him. So we would consider Yoda to be a confidant character. All right, so that concludes the instructional part of our lesson. And we will then move on to